I'm hitting record now. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Rachel, and a huge thank you to Naomi and Mark Chernin, who sponsored this class in memory of Mark's mother, Gita Chernin, Gita Rasa Bat Rifuel Vimalka, Zichrona Livracha. She was an educator who loved to travel and was intimately involved with fostering adult Jewish learning. May her neshama have an aliyah, and thank you so much for your generous sponsorship.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Broria, and thank you, Naomi, and your husband, Mark, of course. I'm happy that we get together to learn in your mother-in-law's memory. I will add that I think it's especially appropriate to learn in a mother-in-law's memory right before Shavuot, because Shavuot is the one holiday where at the center we have a pair of mother and daughter-in-law. And not only is the pair at the center of the book a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, but they have a very positive relationship, which is actually not a joke I'm making about mother and daughter-in-law relationships. It's rather a reference to the fact that most pairs of women whose stories get told in Tanach have somewhat antagonistic relationships. Try and think about women you know of who are heroines or protagonists in a story that has another woman and what the relationship between them is like. Think of Rachel and Leah, sisters who obviously help each other in some ways and yet are competitors for one man's love. Think of Pnina and Hannah, right? Almost every time when we see two women in the same story, they're competing for something. And in many ways, it's an indictment, not of Tanakh, but of the time it was written, the time these events took place, where a woman was disempowered, didn't have as much control over her life, her finances, went from her father's house to her husband's house, and ownership in some sense of the word. And therefore, what resources were available for her, she was more likely to compete over than to share. And what's remarkable, and we will get to that story at the end, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but what's remarkable about Ruth and Naomi is that they work together. They help each other. And it's not coming from a place of plenty. It's not coming because they have so much, so what's the big deal to share? They are, for most of the story, subsisting on meager, non-existent almost income, not even income, just donations, charity. And yet, even though in the famous pyramid of needs, Maslow's famous pyramid of needs, they are very much at the bottom rung, fighting for survival. Instead of turning against each other, they do it together. And this is a remarkable story, a remarkable achievement for a pair of women in Tanakh, a remarkable achievement, I think, for any people facing difficulty and challenge, and in many ways represents the alternative road to some of the bad stories we will discuss today. And I'm not going to say more about it now. I'll just say that Ruth and Naomi will run through our discussion today almost like a through line, because they are constantly the proof that the kind of stories we will encounter where things fall apart, where people turn against each other, where there's a certain disappointment and disillusionment involved in people's relationship with one another and with themselves, it's not fate. It doesn't have to be this way, because Ruth and Naomi show us that even when things are very, very hard, there is another path. So let's hold them in our mind and acknowledge the beautiful choice that you're making, Naomi, to sponsor this class in memory of your mother-in-law. And we will come back to Ruth and Naomi and their relationship with one another as we move forward. But I want to start in somewhere that seems utterly different and perhaps irrelevant to all of that. A place that is central to the holiday we are about to celebrate and famous, and that's Mount Sinai. And the name I gave this class is, did we really receive the Torah on a mountain? Now, every Jewish kid can tell you that the answer is yes, right? That's the story. We went to Mount Sinai, we agreed to receive the Torah, we had the 3 days of preparations that those who were with me here a week ago, we discussed at length, and we got the Torah, right? Very, very simple. And yet Chazal did not consider it to be so simple at all. Let us look in the source sheet, in the first source. It's a famous source. I'm sure you're familiar with it, and we've discussed it in several other classes. And it's actually in a discussion, I should put it in context and say that the discussion that's happening within is wondering how come when the people violated various commandments of God, he didn't destroy them? How come he didn't just annihilate them? After all, God stated out the conditions of the covenant very clearly in several places, and the punishments for violating it are very severe. And yet we know that within 40 days, and we will come back to that story, they build a golden calf, and time again, they violate God's orders, and yet he doesn't destroy them. And when the rabbis try to understand how come God violates the very contract he created and, so to speak, signed, they suggest that perhaps when the people accepted the Torah in Mount Sinai, it wasn't a wholehearted acceptance of the type that commits someone legally. In other words, there's a loophole in the contract, if you will. The people, yes, they signed their contract with God that specifies very severe punishments, but because they signed it under duress, you can make a case to forgive them. And they say the following thing here in Masechet Shabbat. The Gemara cites additional homiletic interpretations on the topic of the revelation at Sinai. The Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain, betachtit hahar, at the bottom of the mountain in Hebrew. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. In other words, not at the foot of the mountain, but rather actually underneath it. And the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. And if not, there will be your burial. Now, I should say that in Hebrew, it doesn't say that he overturned the mountain on them. Rather, it says kafa. He forced it on them. He forced it on top of them like an overturned tub. Rav Haha Bar Yaakov said, from here, there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it is therefore not binding. Rava said, even though they again accepted it willingly this time. In the time of Achashverosh, as it is written, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. And he taught the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Sinai. In other words, we may have technically received the Torah on a mountain, or in this case, underneath a mountain really is the correct answer, but it wasn't real acceptance, I should say. It's not as if we got the Torah and we accepted it willingly, embracing it, making it part of our life. Something was forced onto us, and like people in situations that put their survival at risk do time and time again throughout history, we accepted the situation. We decided to go along with it. That is not the same as receiving the Torah fully. That's not the same as embracing it, as hungrily grabbing it. And we see the lack of acceptance. We see the fact that the people may have said the words, but their spirit didn't change. They didn't transform themselves by accepting a new way of life upon themselves. When within 40 days, following Moshe's so-called disappearance, they built the golden calf. Now, when we look at the sin of the golden calf, there's a lot of interpretations. A lot of ink has been spilled throughout the history of the Jewish people, trying to explain both why the people sinned, what they meant by that, how could they have sinned, how could they have built an egel within 40 days of hearing God's actual voice, and how could they have called that egel, like dance around the egel and says, here is your God who brought you out of Egypt, when all of them witnessed the Exodus, and they knew very well that this thing they just created obviously wasn't the God that got them out of Egypt. So there's all kinds of interpretations, and the purpose of this class is not to look through them, even though it's a fascinating topic, and to see all the different ways you can understand what the sin is, what they meant by it, how many of them were involved in it. Was it a small group? Was it all the people? I don't really want to go into that. What I want to focus on rather is, in a sense, what does it teach us about the way they accepted the Torah? What does it teach us about the quality of their act of accepting the Torah? And to better understand that, or to better unpack what it means, what Chet HaEgel means in this story of the acceptance or lack of acceptance of the Torah, I want to offer, I didn't bring it in English because I only have it in Hebrew, but I will just share it with you. I want to bring something that the Rashar Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, says about the Egel. Rashar Hirsch says that we, in our modern day and age, have a profound misunderstanding when we think about what is idolatry. We think that idolatry means that people genuinely believe in their gods and in their fake deities, that they genuinely believe that this thing that they created now out of gold or out of wood or out of stone somehow is imbued with power in and of itself. Now, if that's what we think, obviously we will think that they're idiots and we'll dismiss their opinions out of hand, right? I can give you an example. When I was in Japan with my family a year and a half ago, or a year and a few months ago, I may have shared this story. I apologize if I did. We went into a souvenir store. It was a beautiful souvenir store. As you walk around in Japan, you want to buy everything you see everywhere because everything is beautiful. Every little tchotchke is beautiful. So we walked through the souvenir store and we put various things into our basket, and we noticed that there's a certain type of figurine with a round face that's really prevalent in the store. You know, it's on the little cups made of wood that we bought. There are plushy toys that my youngest child wanted to buy that are made in the shape of this figurine. It's on the fans, it's on the scarves. Every craft that was represented in the store, and there's a lot of beautiful crafts in Japan, had this symbol on it. I'm like, maybe it's a symbol of the hotel the store is in, maybe it's a mascot of the town. And as we go about filling our basket with various souvenirs, many of which had this figurine on it, we suddenly notice two women sitting and creating these dolls made like this figurine, except in traditional Japanese style, not like the toys you buy here in the store, but made with kimono fabrics. And we looked at them for a while, and it was amazing, an amazing privilege to get to see women still practicing clearly a craft that's rooted in a lot of history. And we stood there for a while. And then Danny, my little one, said, "Oh, look." So we raise our hands and we see a little Shinto temple right behind them with the offerings, with the zigzag pieces of paper that hang over Shinto temples, with all the colors that are symbolic of Shinto temples, actual food. When I say offering, I mean actual food. And what is the deity? It's this figurine that these women are making, and some of them they're putting in the temple, and some of them they're selling to us, the tourists. And that was the moment when they say the pin dropped for us. Is that how we say it? Pin dropped for us. And we realized that this is a deity. This is not a mascot of the hotel or a mascot of the city. This is a Shinto deity. So we very politely put back all the souvenirs on the shelves and tried to look for something a little bit less controversial, shall we say. And for the longest time, I was really perplexed by this scene, because it wasn't the fact that they put their deity on souvenirs that perplexed me. I understand that they have a lot of various deities that they put on everything. I get it. The thing that perplexed me is that they're sitting there making this deity and hanging it on the wall to worship and on another wall to sell as a toy. And it just seemed so stupid to me that you are making it and then you're selling it, you're making your living of it, but at the same time, you're also worshiping another iteration of it. How do you understand that? And it took talking to some people there and talking to a Shinto priest who actually converted to Christianity and moved to Israel to work as a diplomat. And we had many enlightening conversations with him. And to understand that we just misunderstood what they think when they think about those figurines. They don't think of them as this is a creator of the heaven of the earth. They think this is a symbol, a symbolic iteration of some sort of entity that we believe exists among many other entities. Some people believe they saw sightings of it. Some people think it's purely spiritual. It doesn't really matter to them in the way the theological questions matter to us very viscerally. They don't argue over it. Every person believes whatever they want. Definitely the Shinto priests believe something very different than the rest of the populace. They take it very seriously. But the point is more that by having various iterations of this entity, you are showing respect and love. So when you're playing with your plush toy, or when you hang the fan on your wall or use it, you're showing that you respect this deity. So it's a respectful kind of gesture. And the purpose, really, if you, for example, go and bow to the Shinto temple, is not to bow to the doll. It's to kind of acknowledge the deity behind it in the hope that it will favor you. This is where it goes back, where I'm going to go back to Rashar Hirsch, because Rashar Hirsch says something very similar. He says, when people worship idols, they don't worship this piece of wood. They don't worship the piece of gold, if we talk about the golden calf. What they worship is their God, in a sense, at least in the case of Cheta Egel. They're still looking for a connection with our real God who took us out of Egypt, who gave us the Torah. But they're worshiping him in the style of the people around them who believe that you can have physical manifestations of the deity. And this is the serious point. This is the part that's really important and helps us understand what went wrong and why this wasn't a complete reception of the Torah back then. The worship or the gestures of respect that are targeted really at the real God via the proxy of whatever material item you create, be it a cute doll or a golden calf, their purpose is to manipulate and affect God. What do I mean by that? When the Japanese person bows down to the Shinto temple, even though at the same day he might go to a Christian church for a wedding ceremony or to a Buddhist cemetery for a burial ceremony, and that is not considered contradictory or problematic in any way, he is not trying to pay homage to God and say, I submit to your will. Rather, he is trying to curate favor, incur favor with God in the hope that God will submit to his or her will. In other words, the whole perception of divinity in idolatrous cultures, as Rashar Hirsch declares it, and as our previously Shinto priest guy explained it to us about today's world, the purpose or your perception of divinity is that it's this enormous, awesome force that maybe you can manipulate to do your will, or maybe you can harness to your desire, to your designs on the world, if you touch it just right, if you offer it just the perfect gift, or the perfect homage, or the perfect song, or the perfect worship, or if you worship it at exactly the right time. A lot of idolatrous cultures, a lot of pagan cultures have a thing about certain times when you do certain gestures. Much more exact than ours. We have the idea that you can't pray mincha after the sun is set, but that's it, right? It's not so exact. It gives you a certain scale of time. Also, Kriyat Shema, we have a certain period of time within which it's legitimate to do it. Here, you have to be exact, because it's at that point that this divinity is sensitive to your manipulation. And imagine it like a huge, how do you call those machines that you get drinks out of, drinks and candy? Slot machines? Does that ring a bell?
Machine?
Vending machine. Imagine like God is like this huge vending machine, which if you just, I'm sure you've seen vending machines that sometimes if you hit it just right, a Coke will come out even without money. So you need to either have the right coin or hit it just right in the right spot, and your desire will be granted. In other words, your relationship with God is a relationship where God is instrumental to you. You are trying to get a utility out of it, a function out of God. And everything about your religiosity is focused on how to do it, how to get God to comply with what you want. needless to say, this was not God's intention when he gave us the Torah and invited us into a relationship with him, because as Ezra Shar Hirsch points out, the purpose of that relationship is for us to change ourselves. If we want to have God's favor, which we do, we also ask for rain and salvation and all kinds of things that we want. But the way to get it is not to manipulate God. The way to get it is to be worthy of it. And the way to be worthy of it is to live up to a certain ideal that God spelled out to us pretty clearly in Mount Sinai and continued to flesh out in many, many commandments and explanations later. And you can't do that. You can't transform yourself and raise yourself if all you're focused on is what you want from God, is what you want to get out of him, in a sense. You need to focus on what you want to bring to the partnership, on how you want to change for the partnership to work. Think about it as marriage or any real significant partnership between equals, or, God is not our equal, but we're not his children, meaning we're coming to him to sign a covenant with him. When you think of marriage, if your focus in marriage is how to get your spouse to do what you want, it's a very utilitarian and flat kind of relationship. If your focus is how to make the relationship work, how to make our home a pleasant place for both of us, what do I need to do for the relationship to work, and what do I expect in return, that's a very different proposition. I want to suggest that we can the Torah gives a name for this kind of relationship, and that is covenant. I want to offer another more modern name, which is an emotional community. Emotional community is a term that historians have been using to describe history of emotions, something that's very difficult to nail down because emotions are, ephemeral. And yet you can see that at different eras, there's different emotional norms. What are the kind of feelings that are legitimate? What are the kind of feelings that are discouraged? What the kind of feelings that people have language for? What are the kind of feelings, or what are the objects that are worthy of strong feelings in a certain culture? And historian, just a second, let me open the source sheet again. Historian Barbara Rosenwein started talking about emotional communities to talk about the communities or the societies that share these kinds of norms. And we're not going to read the whole thing here. You can read it later. But what I want to say is that when God is inviting us to accept the Torah, what he's inviting us is to accept an emotional community, to enter an emotional community with him, where we share certain norms, where we share certain feelings, where we agree together that certain objects are worthy of feeling strongly about. For example, justice. For example, helping the weak, helping the widow, helping the orphan. For example, truth. We agree together that those are things worthy of strong emotions. We agree that certain things are worthy of abhorrence, like exploitation, like corruption, like people using their power to overcome other people. And we share these norms with God. It's not just about the actual commandments. It's about emotional community that forms when the partners, us and God, come to the relationship willing to work for it, willing to change together. And isn't that amazing that God is willing to accommodate us in such a relationship? When we worship the golden calf, when we grab onto the golden calf, because now we lost Moshe, who knew how to so-called manipulate God and get him to do what we wanted. So we have to create something new to press God's button so he will give us the can of Coke from the divine vending machine, so to speak. We are grabbing for security, grabbing for forcing our will onto reality at the cost of losing all the richness of this kind of community that we can form with God, of this kind of relationship, if you will, that we can form with God. And the question, and this is the question I want to now pursue through other stories in Tanach, is how do you create this kind of community? How do you accept the Torah, so to speak? How do you do that? How can we, the people, in our own lives, and even more importantly, as we raise the next generation and educate the people who follow us, who will come and follow in our footsteps, how do we make sure that the kind of Judaism we practice and we pass on to a generation beyond us isn't the utilitarian, instrumental, fundamentally flat sort of Judaism that first generation of the Israelites coming out of Egypt practiced when they worshipped the Egel. We have several lines through which to pursue it, but I want to ask you first. Does this question resonate for you? Do you feel that it's something you've grappled with? Do you have an answer to offer? It's very general, I know, so it's hard to nail down. But I'd like to hear your experiences, if at all possible. Dan, did you want to say something? I thought I saw you trying to say something. No? Let me bring this question a little bit down to earth. It's kind of like telling someone, tell us your feelings about philosophy, which is a little bit vague and general. So let me bring it down a little bit. How do you teach a child, and this is a concrete question that's backed with experience on my end, how do you teach a child to love God, not because God will give him a candy? Or I'll translate it into even more practical. How do you get your children to think that shul is somewhere they should go, not because there's a candy man handing out candies in shul? Any thoughts?
I was actually like thinking slightly, I don't know, Lahavdil, I guess. But so at the previous school where I worked, there was a problem that many, some of the teachers were, passionate and engaged and, were working so hard, but many of the teachers were just kind of burnt out. And, and they were just kind of coming, and in the staff room, they would be complaining and they hate the kids and, they hate their job and their life and everything. It was very sad for, them, sure. And also, of course, for the kids. And so I was thinking about that. And so clearly we did not have shared values and a shared, emotional community. And I actually talked to the principal to, say like, hey, just so you know, there's this situation. And she says, I know, but I don't know how to change it. Do you? And I'm like, well, no, gosh, I know how to teach a kid. I don't know how to change a community. So yeah, I have been thinking about it quite a lot. I don't really have an answer. When you create your own community, you can hire the people that you want. But as Jews, we got to take the people who are born to us. You know what I mean? And boy, we're different. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I think it's fascinating and very, very important.
Yeah, and I want to grab onto something you said there about choosing your community, like creating your community versus working with the people already there. I think that's a lot of the difficulty in the story, our basic story, the story of the Exodus and Matan Torah and the entry into Israel, the first two generations, really should have been one, but 2 generations of Israelites. You see, if you look at it carefully, that a lot of the difficulty is exactly what you're talking about, that you don't get to choose the people. It's not we will take the best people and create a nation. In a sense, that's what God offers Moshe after Chet Egel. He says, I'll take you and turn you into a big nation, right? I will handpick the person I want in my people. And ultimately, that's not God's choice. God's choice is that the whole nation is to be a partner for this project. And that makes life for people like Moshe very, very difficult, because the whole nation is comprised of a lot of people, some of which are dedicated, law-abiding, etc., and some of which are Korach, the Meraglim, Erev Rav, etc., etc. And you have to work with the community you have, and you have to solve the problem or find a way to encourage the formation of an emotional community, not just amongst a few elect. Somehow it has to encompass everybody. So I think you nailed the problem very, very well. Thank you, Miriam. Anybody wants to add a different or complementary perspective? Yes, Diana. Just we can't hear you.
I unfortunately came late, but I'm very connected to this question. I think talking with children about how fortunate they are with what they have. Eyes that see, ears that hear.
So you're saying that's part of the educational method, you're saying, to kind of
it's a daily teaching.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It connects to something a parenting counselor once told me, that when you raise children, it's not enough to tell them, don't do this, don't do that, right? No, don't do that, don't do that. You have to make your values present. And you have to say, in our family, it's important to us, and therefore, please don't, Or something like what you're saying, say, do you see how much we have? We should be grateful for it. The purpose of this kind of language, this kind of discourse, is to make your own presence unnecessary by putting the values or the ideas at the center, making the child used to thinking about them, so that when you fade back, as the child inevitably grows, they have already internalized it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you stay on the level of rebuking the child, then you make yourself indispensable, because it's only as long as you're there that they get not to do that. Because as she said, kids are amazingly adapted, letting a rebuke to come here and go out there. It's just not, they're perfectly capable of hearing it from one ear and losing it this next second. So in a sense, what you're saying, what I like about what you're saying, Diana, is exactly that, that in many ways, the art or the work of passing on the values or emotions or emotional norms and ethical norms that are part of our emotional and national community, the art of that is how to make it in a positive way, that it will stand on its own within other people, rather than requiring us to be the shepherds. In some ways, this was the difficulty that at the end of the day left Moshe on the wrong side of the Jordan River, if you think about it. Because Moshe rose as a leader with a generation that needed constant guidance, to the point that when he's told 38 years later to talk to a rock, the default he goes for is hitting this. And it's a symbolic moment, because this was the kind of relationship he had with the people. It was a rebuking relationship, a pushing relationship, a making them go in the right direction by force kind of relationship. And as a generation that stand before him in the moment when he hits the rock and at the end of his days, is a different generation. It's a generation that already needs to be able to stand on their own feet and go into Israel on their own without constant guidance and take ownership. They need to be talked to. They need to take these values and make them their own. And as Rabbi Sachs suggests, this is why God says, sorry, Moshe, you can't go in. It's not just punishment. It's just, you just shown that the kind of leader you are, which was necessary for this generation, is not something you can adapt away from to work with the next generation, to work with the next kind of a challenge. So that's definitely an element of it. Any more comments or suggestions? Or shall we delve into the text and see some of the tips or the ideas that we can glean there? I want to just add one thing before we do that. There's a lot of talk in our circles about Jewish continuity. And a lot of times people refer to it and mean it in a very, very narrow sense. They mean, will your child marry a Jewish person? Will their children be halachically Jewish? Which is, of course, important. But the truth is that the problem of Jewish continuity is much broader, because you can have perfectly Jewish children who don't share your norms, your beliefs, and your values. The question of Jewish continuity is, how do you create a society that continues past yourself, past your present generation? That is the challenge that Moshe and God are facing when they're forming this community to start with, the Jewish emotional community, and they need to somehow help it maintain itself and pass on its values. And Moshe, as we know, is very concerned about it. Throughout Deuteronomy, he tells them, you have to pass on the stories, you have to pass on the beliefs, etc., 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 or you will forget the covenant. In other words, the continuity of the covenant will be broken. And it's a problem that we've been struggling with throughout history, not just on the immediate level of who our children are, but on the level of, can we raise them to value what we think is valuable? Can we raise them to accept the, multi-generational package of values and ideas and stories and emotions and emotional norms that we inherited, and hand it to them and hope that they will treat it well and absorb it and make it their own? This is the challenge. This is broadly speaking, the challenge of Jewish continuity. And I want, in the time we have left, and we will continue longer than the set time, but in the time we have left, I want to touch upon several stories not laws, not commandments, not places where God directly talks about this challenge, but rather stories that explore this problem from different directions to try and see how, if we can see what are some tips or tools that the stories of Tanakh offer us as we face this problem. As we, in other words, and I'm tying it back to what we started with, try not simply to receive the Torah like so much unwanted baggage that's forced upon us, but rather truly absorb it and make sure that the next generation or the people around us, like those burnt out teachers you were talking about, Miriam, accept it as well in a real emotional, internalizing, transformative sort of way. So let us delve straight into some text here. And the first story I want to go into is a story I in person find very, very interesting. It's the story of one of the greatest Shoftim, Gidon. Sorry, before I share it, I'll just give context. Gidon is a young man from Shevet Menashe who lives in the mountain range of Israel, close to Emek Yisrael, at a time when the Midianites, the Amalekites, the Ishmaelites, her hordes, because there were people who were semi-nomadic, keep coming into Israel and taking all of the food from the fertile areas of Jezreel Valley and southern Israel. So here the story focuses on Jezreel Valley, where for 7 years, every year, the people sow seeds, grow the wheat, and these hordes come and take everything, and people are starving. And it's inside this situation that we meet Gidon for the first time. And he's presented as a young man from a not important family who does something peculiar from the get-go. So let's see it here. An angel of God, I'm in box 3. An angel of God came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Yoash the Aviezri. His son Gidon was then beating out wheat inside a wine press in order to keep it safe from the Midianites. This little detail that he beats out wheat inside a wine press already gives us a sense of the misery of this time, because where do you usually beat out wheat? In a tall, windy place, so that all the I don't know how you call it, but the parts of the wheat you don't want will fly away naturally and make your work easier. And here you're in a wine press, you're in an enclosed place. It's extremely inconvenient. It means that all the trash, all the parts you don't want fall in the same place as the wheat, and you're going to have to work so much harder, and everything is just to keep yourself away from sight from the people who would otherwise come and take it from you. The angel of God appeared to him, and in verse 12, God is with you, valiant warrior. Now, most commentators and modern scholars agree that this was just a normal kind of blessing. Like you say hello, so you say God is with you, like it's just a way to say hello. And therefore, not a way that should evoke anything in Gidon other than, oh, hello to you too, God is with you as well. Except that clearly these words, God is with you, it's like pressing a button. It makes Gidon explode. Gidon said to him in verse 13, please, my Lord, if God is with us, why has all this befallen us? Where are all those wondrous deeds about which our fathers, it says here ancestors, but really it says fathers, told us, saying, truly God brought us up from Egypt. Now God has abandoned us and delivered us into the hands of Midian. I want to pause here for a second and point out that this is a remarkable statement, because we were led to believe early in the book of Judges that the people no longer remembered the stories of the Exodus. It says quite literally in Judges 2 that the people forgot the Exodus and forgot God, and this is what set them on the horrific cycle of Judges of forgetting God, abandoning the covenant, being abandoned in turn, suffering under the hands of an oppressor, and being saved by a judge, and over again. So there was this sense, at least on a declaration level, that the story of the Exodus has been lost in the mists of time. And yet here we are meeting a genuine Israelite who remembers the story of the Exodus and who heard it from his father. In other words, exactly in the way Moshe told them to pass the story, right? That the parents should pass it to the children, and the children in their turn, when their parents, they should pass it to their children, etc., etc., etc. So it seems as if it worked. The condition for Jewish continuity, as Moshe understands it in Dvarim, when he tells them, tell the story lest you forget the covenant, has been fulfilled. the story passed from father to son, and it passed enough to leave such an imprint in Gideon's mind that he is angry when he looks around him and sees that God didn't save the people, because he contrasts the miserable reality that's exemplified by him beating wheat in the winepress with the grand miracles of the Exodus. The problem with this picture, of course, is that the story may have passed, but the point of the story, the point Moshe wanted to pass down the generation, was lost along the way. Because the point of the story of the Exodus wasn't God is capable of great miracles, and therefore you will get great miracles. The point was always God is capable of great miracles, but you have to deserve them. V'haya im shamoa tishmeu, right? If you listen to the words of God, then God will give you all those great things. It's not something you just receive. You're not entitled to it. It's part of a relationship. It's part of a covenantal relationship. Like we said when we talked about idolatry, it's not that you press a button and it happens. You manipulate God just right and it happens. You give him the right offerings and it happens. No, you have to change yourself. You need to live up to a certain ideal for God to be in the sort of relationship with you within which he will grant you great miracles and salvation. And we find out very soon after this text that we just read that Gideon's family and the same father who told him the story very much don't live up to the kind of relationship that the covenant encompasses. Because if you will look, I'm still in the same text, but verse 25, that night God said to him, take the young bull belonging to your father and another bull 7 years old, pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred post that is beside it. Then build an altar to the eternal your God on the level ground on top of the stronghold. Take the other bull and offer it as a burnt offering using the wood of the sacred post that you have cut down. The same father who shared the stories of the Exodus also owned, presumably built, an altar and a post dedicated to other deities. The basic tenet of the covenant with God is Lo ta'asu lachem elokim acherim al panai. You shall not make other gods before me. So clearly, somehow the father didn't have any cognitive dissonance, didn't suffer from cognitive dissonance in teaching his son the story, totally missing the point himself and passing on this misconception to his son, which I think offers us one important key for creating Jewish continuity, which is the mitzvot, the stories, the practices like prayer, like Shabbat, are not enough in and of themselves. It's up to us, parents, educators, in setting a personal example to our neighbors, not just kids who are younger than us. It's up to us to make it clear to people what's the point of all of this. Otherwise, it's just this much headache, It's practices that overpower your life. It's stories that in modern terms sometimes don't make sense or seem to belittle women, for example, go against values that we hold as modern people. If we don't succeed at centering all of these things that we're trying to pass on and to model for other people around us around the point, and the point being that we need to transform ourselves into people who are worthy of a mutual covenantal relationship with God, then we're giving them the bits and pieces, but we're missing the heart. We're missing the center of it all, the thing that gives it meaning. In other words, my parenting counselor was right when she said, don't just tell your kids, don't do this, don't do that, do that. Tell them, we in our family value this, and therefore we don't do this or don't do that. We in our family believe that we are in a relationship with God, and therefore we do all these things that seem to you like such a headache right now. And let's be honest, seem like a headache to me at times too. So that is one, I think, piece of the puzzle of Jewish continuity, of making sure the Torah is not just passed on technically, but received, to truly accepted and received. A different piece hides, I'm going to skip the Iftach story. A different piece, I think, hides in the Iftach story, another famous story from Shoftim, where we hear about a boy, Iftach, who is a son of a man, a legitimate citizen of Gilad, and a prostitute. And because he's a son of a prostitute, his brothers, who are his father's sons from his legitimate wife, end up banishing him from his home, saying, we don't want you to inherit with us because you're the son of a strange woman. This boy, nobody stops these brothers. The community doesn't step up for him. He goes out of civilization. He collects a group of other disaffected people and becomes a bandit, a highwayman. Except one day down the line, the people need him because they're facing a horrible encroachment and threat from the Ammonites to the east, and they need someone to lead them in a battle. And they go to try and solicit help from the very boy who was banished from their midst. But as you say in Hebrew, Iftach is not a friar. He doesn't just say, sure, I'm going to go and do that for you. He says, why should I do that? You abandoned me. Why should I help you? And he doesn't relent until they promise him and make a solemn oath that he's going to be their leader, not just in battle, but rather he's going to be the head of Gilad. And it's this amazing rags to riches story, right? The boy who was banished, the son of a prostitute, comes back to glorious applause as the savior of Gilad, which he does do. He leads them to glorious victory. And as the new mayor, chieftain, I'm not sure what's the term and what's the relationship that existed between leaders and people at the time, but the boy who had no place in their midst now has the place on top of their hierarchy. Except that it doesn't really work out. It doesn't work out for him at all, because in the day of his glory, in the day that he won, an oath he carelessly made as he went to battle, that whoever comes first out of his house to greet him, he will sacrifice him to God, comes back to bite him when his daughter famously comes out of the house singing and welcoming the returning hero that he is. And Iftach, in a move that shocked the rabbis, follows along on his oath. He doesn't back out of it. He doesn't search for a way to invalidate it. He doesn't pray to God. He doesn't consult with the scholars. He follows up on his oath. He immediately says, I'm going to have to do it. He doesn't even seek a way out of his oath. And he either, as it seems in the simple shot, kills his daughter or locks her up somewhere without letting her, have children. One way or another, he sacrifices his daughter to God, as if God wants human sacrifices, based on this oath that he made. And then in another horrific episode, the people of a different tribe come and attack him and tell him, how dare you fight without our permission and involvement? And instead of negotiating with them, as Gideon himself did in a different scene, he goes to war against them and kills 42,000 Ephraimites, people from the tribe of Ephraim. In other words, everything he touches, he leaves in shambles. Yes, he led the people to victory, but his own home is destroyed. He has no other children. That's it. His whole future is gone. And the national home is destroyed because he created this horrific, not created, but escalated what was an argument into a horrific civil war that killed 42,000 fellow Jews. And when we wonder why that is his end, why couldn't we have a nice story about a guy who was banished but then came back and helped the people? I think the answer lies in the fact that even though Iftach changed his place in the hierarchy, right, from the no good banished outlaw to head of the town, head of the tribe, he didn't change the terms of the contract, of the social contract. The emotional community he lived in as a child is an emotional community where a child can be ostracized and banished. It's a society where self-interest and ambition override loyalty, duty, compassion. It's an emotional community where the one driving force is, what can I get out of it for myself? So at some point, he was the weakest link and he suffered from this social structure. But when he has an opportunity to return, he doesn't change the basic tenor of this emotional community. He just wants to be on top of it. His self-interest and ambition drive him And he's willing to let the people die under attack by the Ammonites if they don't give him what he wants. So he perpetuates the emotional system, the normative system that saw him banished. And I think the message the text is sending to us is very deep. It says that you can't redeem anything without changing its terms on the foundational level. You can't just make it something different. You have, sorry, I hear my child screaming at me from outside. So I will excuse myself for 10 seconds, okay? Sorry. Daddy, come on. Sorry, because we're running late, he's already back from school. So sorry, but he's okay. You can't change something by accepting the basic terms upon which it's founded. In other words, if you want to pass on Jewish values, you have to change, you have to make sure that the emotional community you're part of is built on the concepts of loyalty, community, connection. You can't expect continuity, just like Iftach can't expect, Danny, honey, just a minute, okay? You can't expect continuity in values if you don't establish an environment that is a vessel for continuity emotionally. In other words, why would your children, let's put it in the simplest terms, why would your children accept the values you're trying to educate them in if they don't see that you value them and you're loyal to them and you care about them? If you don't model for them caring for one another, why would they pass on and care values that center around the idea of covenant and caring for one another? It's not enough to pass the ideas and the values. You have to create an emotional community where there's a channel for such things to pass forward. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I explained it very well with Danny-led interruptions here, but you know, part of forming an emotional community with your own child is hearing him when he screams at you from downstairs. So I apologize. I'm modeling what I'm talking about. I want to now go to a last important example. I'm going to skip some of the things because we're running out of time, but I want to, before we go back to Mount Sinai, I want to go to the relationship that I mentioned in the beginning, the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. And I kept saying in the beginning that this relationship is the alternative. It's the other path. Sorry, just a second. Anyway, I'm sorry. You can tell me in 5 minutes, Danny. For now, come and say hi to my friends, okay? Come and say hi to my friends here. This is Danny. Danny is my assistant teacher today. Right? Anyway, we're talking about Ruth and Naomi from Megillat Ruth. And how Ruth and Naomi formed the alternative path. Because all these stories, the story of Gideon, where the stories were passed, but without the point, without the center, the value that gives the meaning. Or the story of Iftach, where there's a desire for continuity, but the continuity is compromised by the fact that there's no emotional rapport, an emotional commitment that can serve as a channel. Okay, in your room, honey, that can serve as a channel for passing on the values. Ruth and Naomi show us that at times, even when things are desperate, even when there's no hope of a future, investing in the relationship, investing in devotion and loyalty and care for one another can create a future ad nihilo. Because when Ruth follows Naomi, Naomi tells her very honestly, I'm old, I'm not going to have more sons, I have no more husbands to give you. Clearly, Naomi is not thinking about other relatives like Boaz at this point. This only comes later. She has no thought of having any future to offer Ruth. And Ruth says, it's okay. Wherever you're buried, I'll be buried, and wherever you die, I'll die. I'm willing to go with you into a dead end of an existence. It's an irrational kind of devotion. I think any rational observer would say, Ruth, you're throwing your life away. You're still young. You're still fertile. You can create a life for yourself. And it's not like Naomi wants you. She tells you not to go with her. Why are you doing this? And yet, against reason, beyond self-interest, even in its most generous form, Ruth chooses devotion. Ruth chooses loyalty. And at first, it's not appreciated. After Ruth makes her big, impassionate speech, Naomi doesn't respond. Naomi sees that she insists and just lets her come with her, but she doesn't include her. She doesn't hug her. She doesn't, when she makes a speech to the people of the city that she came back empty from Moab, she doesn't say, except my daughter-in-law who came with me, and I'm very grateful to. It's as if she's dead inside. She's not receptive to anything. So Ruth is pouring devotion not only into a dead-end future, but into what looks like a dead-end relationship. And yet she does it anyway. It is only after Ruth goes out of her way to collect wheat in the fields, and only after her devotion inspires Boaz to his own act of chesed in caring for her, that Naomi awakens to the possibility of a future, thinks, oh, this man is a redeemer, makes her plan about going to the threshing floor, sends Ruth to talk to him, and brings about the future that opens up, a future that includes David Melech, right? At the end of the day. And that it's not just a future that includes someday down the line, David Melech. It's a future that transformed the city, because the same people who were very cold towards Naomi and dismissive of her, at the end celebrate with her and tell her, oh, this is a baby born from your daughter-in-law who's dearer and more important than any son could be. And they acknowledge this relationship. But it all starts from a woman who goes directly against self-interest, directly against the natural desire to have a future, and throws herself into an act of devotion. In other words, a woman who comes into a community that's cold and estranged and difficult, and forces herself to carry inside herself, in a sense, a principle or a center for the emotional community that's opposed to the tenor of the emotional community she's inside now. Because if they're pursuing self-interest, she's not going to play by that rule. Instead, she is pursuing loyalty. She is pursuing love. And I think maybe that's the deepest answer. That if we want ourselves and the people around us, and I think, Miriam, this goes to your question about other adults around us and not just the children of the next generation who we know how to raise at the end of the day, or we hope we do. I hope I do. Sometimes the way to create an emotional community that can encourage us to all come together and be part of the covenant and pass it on. It's not about the stories. It's not even about putting the point in the center. It's not even about creating just particular relationship. Sometimes it's about going against self-interest, going against reason, doing things that don't make sense in the name of loyalty and devotion. Because when we pour so much of ourselves into something without an expectation of return, we're doing the exact opposite of what the Israelites did when they built the golden calf, according to Rashar Hirsch. We're not focusing on trying to control someone else to serve our interest, but rather we set our interest aside to devote ourselves to someone else. And that is, in a sense, the essence of covenant. This is the essence of what God offered us in Egypt and what we have been struggling to rise up to and to accept truly and fully ever since, even though apparently when we stood on that mountain or underneath it, according to the Midrash, we weren't quite ready for that yet. May we, in each generation and each of us in our own lives, rise up to that challenge, allow the covenant to embrace us and transform us by setting self-interest aside and choosing devotion, loyalty, and love time and time again. And may your mother-in-law's neshama have an aliyah, Naomi. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
and
you, Raphael.
you for making this happen despite technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's wonderful inspiration to head into Shavuot. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, and Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Rachel. It was a beautiful tribute to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you. I'm
Thank
honored
you,
that you allowed me to speak in our memory. Thank you. And may we hear only Besorot Tovot, God willing.
Amen.
Thank you.
Everyone.
And tell Danny I will tell his old friend Laura that I saw him today.
I'll tell him.
I don't know if
that
they
he-
remember, either one remembers, but
But it's still it's sweet. Goodbye, ladies.
Chag Sameach.